An amendment would now...
Oh, I do have an amendment at the desk, if I may be recognized.
Pardon?
I have an amendment at the desk, if I may be recognized.
Let me go to the Democratic side. Oh, okay. Gentleman's recognized. Mr. Radanovich, you have an amendment to offer to the bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Number 595A at the desk. It's the 100% electricity price increase amendment.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recently in California, the California Air Resources Air Board released a report that talked about the California global warming bill that would actually benefit California's economy. But Dorothy Rothrick, who's a spokeswoman for the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, says this analysis is long on wishful thinking but short on economic reality. Even though it was supported by the Sierra Club and the NRDC, she went on to state that there is no evaluation of the real-time costs that California businesses and consumers will pay up front. She says, governments can get away with deficit spending, but in the real world, families and businesses have to pay bills every month or there are severe consequences, says Shelley Sullivan, who's the executive director of AB 32 Implementation Group. We are looking at billions in increased electricity, natural gas, gasoline, and fuel prices, billions in new carbon fees and water fees, higher building costs, rents, and mortgages, and the California Air Resources Air Board assumes that we can afford to pay for all this and wait for savings 12 years from now. Ms. Sullivan and Ms. Rothrick worry that increased regulation and costs will result in business flight to other states or countries where less stringent laws would ensure an overall increase in pollution. Ironically, a California business could relocate to India or China, where the mix of energy consumption includes coal, which would pollute the atmosphere worse than if it stayed in California, says Rothrick. The state's industries are among the cleanest in the world because of strict regulations, she says. Higher taxes, fuel, and labor costs already mean that doing business in California costs more than anywhere in the United States. And it's with that in mind that I submit this legislation that states that under the reporting of the Secretary of Labor, if there's under the reporting of the Secretary of the Energy, if there's a 100% increase above 2009 electric rates adjusted for inflation, that the provisions of Title III of this Act will cease to be effective. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have to say, and I ask for a recorded vote on this amendment.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Mr. If I may reclaim just a couple of minutes.
Yes.
I do want to state that Edison Electric in Southern California just today increased their rates from anywhere between 10 to 15% on residential users. So this is the effect that Californians are having on their state global warming bill. And this type of rate increases on residential users will be experienced nationwide if this type of legislation is adopted. And with that, I yield back and thank the chair and ask for a recorded vote.
What, Mr. Chairman?
Gentlemen, yield to you.
I
Mr.
just
Radanovich, you could
yield it back.
Mr. Barton.
Would yield to Mr.
I
Barton.
want to make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Yeah. Well, the gentleman is correct.
Ask for a call of the committee.
Well, we could do that, but why don't we continue to debate this? You want everybody here for the debate?
Oh, okay. I thought, sure, no. I'm not ready to, you can,
We'll debate
I don't mind.
We'll
Sure.
wait till...
Okay, fine. Yeah.
We
Gentlemen,
can just have a
withdraws.
show of hands on this amendment. I think.
Well, we're not ready yet because we haven't debated it. We've only heard one side.
Yeah, we could vote it right now. That's a good point.
You're all anxious to vote.
just a show of hands. We can avoid the roll call.
Okay. Well, that would be helpful. But let's if gentleman's time is almost over, but he's yielded it back. So the chair will recognize himself. And with all due respect, I do have to oppose this amendment. This amendment, like so many of the other amendments we've had during this markup, provides that if a certain event occurs, the provisions of Title III will cease to be effective. And I don't think that makes sense. You're trying to put out all sorts of awful situations that would require us to act and act immediately. But whether the action should be that the whole Title III of this proposed bill, this proposed law, should be ineffective is a serious question, and I think an inappropriate response. I don't want an automatic off-ramp which dissolves the legislation. There'll be a lot of consequences to that, and we may well need to address the specific problem that is causing, in this case, on this amendment, as much as 100% increase over 2009 electric rates adjusted for inflation. So with all due respect, think this is not I know it's a message amendment. I know it's for many of you to say those who support this proposed law weren't even willing to look at the fact that there could be a tremendous increase in rates. Well, we do care about the increases in rates, and we would want to respond to the increase in rates, but the only response that you are suggesting we take is the one that you want to ordain now, and that's to stop the whole law from taking effect and staying in effect. So it's a meat-axe approach. It doesn't deal with the problem, whatever the problem is going to be. We don't anticipate rates to be increasing as a result of the way the market has been structured, and as a result of the space amendment that is going to protect the ratepayers by making sure that the allocations are used to protect those ratepayers from any increase in their utility costs. I also want to say in response to my friend from California, if there are increases in California's rates, I don't want it to be stated as a fact that it's due to California's energy law. I remember so well when California had the spike in our electricity rates, and we met with Vice President Cheney, and we said California's on the ropes because our wholesale rates were so high. You've got to help us. And he said, well, that's due to your environmental laws. You shouldn't have all those environmental protection laws in California. Well, you know, it turned out that what we told him was right, that we were being gouged by the wholesalers, the Enron company particularly. And the reason we know this was true is when we found out that the tapes from Enron, conversations of executives, that they would withhold wholesale power just to drive up the rates. They even chuckled over the fact that a lot of elderly and low-income people were going to have to pay a lot more for their electricity, but they were going to make a lot more profit as a result of it. So I wouldn't jump to conclusions, as we sometimes hear from people who say California's problems are due to environmental laws, and I think the suggestion is if there are increases in California, it's due to our environmental energy laws. I won't accept that as a fact that could just be stated, because I don't believe that to be true, and I would want to see a lot more evidence than just a statement of fact. This amendment is now before us.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield on that moment?
Yes.
You know, the chair mentioned that these are nothing but message amendments. I'm looking here at my BlackBerry, and since we started this markup, I've received 5 attack messages from the Republican National and NRCC Communications, the latest one being last night at 10:29 last night, saying that we're against jobs, saying we're against America, saying we're for high prices of. So you're absolutely right. This is just another message amendment, and those of us on the committee who may be in, like in my case, a Republican-leaning seat, but I'm a Democrat, we can be assured there'll be another press release. So I've had 5 now in the first 2 days, and I'm sure when we're done with this markup, by the time we're done, probably be at least 3 more. So these are just message amendments. They're not sincere. They're not really towards promoting good legislation or correcting or identifying a problem. It's just for message. So I hope we would stay united and vote no, because I don't want to be the only one getting these emails. Thanks. Now yield back.
Mr. Barton, you ask seeking
recognition. Speak in support of it. Well, first of all, truth in advertising. Some of these do have a message. There's no question about that. It's not necessarily an attack on our friends on the majority side as much as is it an effort to send a message to the American people that we want to protect them from what we think are the potential ravages of this bill. We have offered a a price protection amendment at 10%. We've offered a price protection amendment at 20%, and now we're offering it at 100%. At some point in time, there should be some recognition from the proponents of this legislation that if prices do go too high, Title III, this particular amendment refers to Title III, which is the cap and trade mechanism, shall cease to exist. Now, there are sections in the bill that we've not addressed yet where there are massive unemployment compensation schemes in place. So there is some recognition in parts of this bill that there are going to be some negative economic consequences. We're just trying to put a price cap on the electricity increase. And again, there's an acknowledgement of that on the majority side. We did accept an amendment from Mr. Space of Ohio that has some effect on that, which is an improvement in the bill. I also want to comment very briefly on the comments about the California electric market from several years ago. California devised its own electricity market within the state of California in which they outlawed long-term contracts between distribution companies and power suppliers. They created a system where everybody who provided power to electricity users in California had to buy that power on the spot market every day. They then, because of various restrictions that the state put in place on new power construction, hadn't built a new power plant in California in between 5 and 10 years. And when the California population and economy grew, they created a situation where you had a limited amount of power that had to be auctioned off every day on the spot market. And the Enrons of the world, seeing that situation, did take advantage of it. Chairman's correct about that. But the California legislature itself created the environment in which they didn't allow long-term contracts. They didn't allow power, large power consumers to enter into direct contracts with power suppliers outside of the state, and they forced everybody to buy their power on the spot market. And to compound it, they added a provision that everybody who bought power on the spot market had to pay the market clearing price that the last person to put power into the market.
Will the gentleman yield? I agree with what the gentleman's saying, but the true problem with the crisis in California was failure of the then Governor Gray Davis to act to force the utilities into long-term contracts immediately, which would have ended the crisis then and there. And it was that he could have done that, but it was that failure of leadership that extenuated the problem in California.
Reclaim my time. We finally, the Bush administration and the FERC chairman then was a gentleman named Pat Wood from Houston, Texas, put price caps on the California market. The FERC then authorized a series of investigations that ended up in some of the market manipulators paying massive refunds and going to jail. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to proceed to a vote, but the Chair wants to just make a very brief statement. California had a very dysfunctional market based on a law that was promoted by Ken Lay and Enron and some of the other big companies. And then they took advantage of it. And my only point in raising that was not to get into the emotional debate about who did what in California, but Vice President Cheney said to me personally, the problem in California is you have all those environmental laws. That's why California is paying such high rates for electricity. And he refused to acknowledge what we knew later to be the case, that Enron was taking advantage of this dysfunctional market that was created. But on the amendment that's pending, I think we just have to disagree. There is no point where we'll say the law ought to be put out of effect, because there are a lot of consequences when that happens. There are people who will be relying on the law, and just to suddenly pull the rug out from everybody and say the law is no longer effective is not a solution to a problem that we do not anticipate to exist. And if it does exist, it may not be the appropriate response. So we have a disagreement over this issue. We've had a number of amendments on it, and I would urge defeat of the amendment. How do you wish to proceed? Do you want a show of hands? Do you want a roll call vote? Okay, let's go to a roll call vote.
Mr. Chair.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshue. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gett. Mr. Gett, no. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radanovich. Mr. Radanovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick, Mr. Sutton, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, Mr. Burgess, Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey, Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye.
The clerk will call those members who have not yet responded to the roll.
Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will tally the vote. Mr. Markey, you want to vote on
Not
this?
recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you are recorded.
Markey? Mr. Markey votes no.
Mr. Burgess, are you recorded?
Oh, let's see. Not recorded. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Okay.
Is the clerk ready to report the vote?
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 19 ayes and 30 noes.
19 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.